At a high-profile gala, my wife's daughter went live and pointed at me saying, "My stepfather, he's just temporary. He's my mom's retirement plan." A few people laughed. My wife smiled in agreement and didn't say a word. I stayed silent, pulled out my phone and texted my lawyer, because right then I knew it was over for them. 10 minutes later, the laughter was gone as her accounts started locking one by one, and when she screamed, my wife's face went pale. Before we go further, I am genuinely grateful you chose to spend your time here. Comment below and tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one. Also, a brief note. Some elements of this story are fictional, included for narrative and educational value. Similarities to any names or places are coincidental, but what this story teaches you is worth holding on to. The briefcase on my lap is old. The leather has cracked along the left corner, and the brass latch no longer snaps shut the way it used to. I bought it at an estate sale on Abercorn Street back in 1991, paid $12 for it, which even then was less than what it was worth. I have always had a talent for recognizing value in things other people overlook. It is, I suppose, the one skill I was ever truly good at. My name is Arthur Sterling. I am 68 years old. For the past 31 years, I have worked as a document archivist at a firm on Factors Walk down by the Savannah River, where the old cotton warehouses still lean over the cobblestone like men too tired to stand straight. My work is not glamorous. I spend my days with paper deeds of sale land grants, probate records correspondence between people long dead. Most of what I handle is brittle and faded, the kind of thing that gets boxed up in an attic and forgotten until someone dies and their children don't know what to do with it. I catalog it. I preserve it. I make sure the record survives. People have asked me over the years whether it gets lonely working with the dead. I tell them no. The dead, in my experience, are far more honest than the living. The hallway outside Courtroom 4 in the Chatham County Courthouse is long and high-ceilinged, with marble floors that turn every footstep into an echo. At 7:30 in the morning, it is mostly empty. A janitor pushed a cart past me 20 minutes ago without looking up. A young attorney in a too-new suit walked by with his head down reading something on his phone. Neither of them paid me any attention. I am 68 years old and wearing a navy blue suit that I have owned since 2004. I am not the kind of man people notice. Percival Oakes stood 2 steps to my left, close enough that I could hear his breathing. He has been my steward for 19 years, and in those 19 years, I do not think he has ever asked me an unnecessary question. This morning was no different. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask if I was ready. He simply stood there, hands folded in front of him, and let the silence be what it needed to be. I looked down at the briefcase. Inside it were 5 years of work. Bank statements, surveillance logs, notarized affidavits, pharmaceutical records, property filings, and a chain of custody report that Julian Thorne had spent the better part of 4 months assembling with the kind of precision that would have made a federal prosecutor envious. There were photographs. There were recordings, audio and video, all obtained through legal means, all properly documented. There was a letter handwritten that I had composed on a Tuesday evening in October of 2024, when I was reasonably certain things were going the way I intended, and I allowed myself just briefly to feel something close to relief. 5 years of work contained in a cracked leather briefcase that cost $12. Outside the tall window at the end of the hallway, I could see one of Savannah's old live oaks. It was a large tree, its branches strung with Spanish moss that moved slowly in the January wind, like the fringe of a curtain pulled by a draft from under a door. The sky behind it was the color of pewter, cold light, the kind of morning that does not offer warmth, only visibility. I have lived in Savannah for 43 years. I came here from Athens, Georgia at 25, after finishing my graduate studies at the University of Georgia, and I never left. I built my life here slowly and quietly, the firm on Factors Walk, the house on the south side of Forsyth Park, The years of work that most people would call unremarkable, and that I would call exactly what I intended them to be. Stirling Manor is a Greek revival house built in 1847. Its ceilings are 14 feet high. Its floors are heart pine dark with age. I have lived in it for 30 years, and for most of those years, it was the one place on earth where I felt entirely like myself. Preston Thorne felt the same way about it. He used to say that a house like that had memory built into its walls, that if you were quiet enough, you could still hear the arguments and the celebrations and the ordinary Tuesday evenings that had soaked into the plaster over 150 years. Preston believed that. He was the kind of man who believed that places remembered things even when people forgot. Preston has been dead for 18 years. I heard footsteps at the far end of the hallway, not the shuffling pace of the janitor or the hurried clip of the young attorney. These were deliberate steps, evenly spaced. The footsteps of a man who has walked into difficult rooms his entire professional life and has long since stopped dreading it. I did not need to look up to know who it was. Detective Miles Quarry of the Savannah-Chatham Metropolitan Police Department has a particular way of moving through a space. He occupies it without ceremony. He arrived at the bench where I was seated, glanced down at the briefcase, then at me, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How are you holding up, Mr. Stirling?" "Fine," I told him. He nodded once, as though that was the answer he expected, and took a seat on the far end of the bench. He was not there to comfort me. He was there because the case that had consumed the last 14 months of his professional life was about to reach its conclusion. And Miles Quarry was not the kind of man who waited for that sort of thing anywhere other than where it was happening. I looked back down at the briefcase and rested my palm flat against the leather. People have asked me, journalists mostly, and a few acquaintances who have known me long enough to feel entitled to the question why I did it. Why a 68-year-old man would choose to spend 5 years of his life this way. Why I would marry someone I despised. Why I would invite that kind of darkness into a house that had already seen too much of it. The answer is not simple, it never was. But if you want to understand it, if you truly want to understand what brought all of us to this hallway on a gray January morning in Savannah, then you have to go back. Not to 2020, when I first made the decision. Not to 2019, when I first saw Eleanor's face at an auction on the south side of the city. You have to go back to October of 2006, to a staircase inside Stirling Manor, on a night when the moss on the oaks was dark with rain, and Preston Thorne, the best friend I ever had, took his last breath while I was still 20 minutes away. That is where this story begins. That is the only place it could begin. Memory has a smell. Whenever I drift back to October 14th, 2006, the first thing that reaches me is not an image or a sound. It is cold coffee, a mug left forgotten on the kitchen counter of Stirling Manor sometime around 9 that evening, abandoned because I had gone back to my desk to finish cataloging a set of land deeds. The phone rang at 11:12. I know the exact time because I looked at the old Seth Thomas regulator on the kitchen wall when I stood to answer it. The voice on the other end was young and slightly unsteady. "Mr. Stirling, this is Detective Miles Quarry, Savannah-Chatham Metro. I'm calling about Preston Thorne. Preston and I had been friends for 41 years. We met during our first week at the University of Georgia in the fall of 1965, in a survey course on American history that neither of us particularly wanted to take. He borrowed a pen from me because he had forgotten his. He never gave it back. I never asked. By the time the semester ended, he was the closest friend I had ever had. Preston ran Thorne Properties, a real estate development firm here in Savannah, with a portfolio worth roughly $8.5 million at the time of his death. He was generous to a fault, the kind of generous that made practical people uneasy because it left no room for suspicion. He trusted people at their word. He believed in the most earnest way that most people were doing their best. That was the thing about Preston I loved most. It was also the thing that killed him. He met Eleanor at the Telfair Museums in the spring of 2004. She was dressed in that particular shade of gray suggesting recent grief, without stating it outright, composed a little sad, and standing very still in front of a painting, as though she had nowhere else to be. Preston told me about her the following week over lunch on River Street. I remember thinking, even then, the composed and sad in combination deserved more scrutiny than admiration. I said nothing. I had no grounds for a warning based on instinct alone. Over the next 18 months, Eleanor made herself indispensable. She never asked for money directly. She constructed instead a series of small situations in which Preston's generosity was the natural solution to a problem that only appeared accidental. By the time he proposed to her in November of 2005, she had already worked her way into his financial affairs in ways I did not fully understand until much later. What none of us knew was that Eleanor had done this before. Her first husband, a retired contractor from Beaufort, South Carolina, had died 14 months into their marriage. His estate, valued at approximately $2.3 million, had passed to Eleanor through documents that contained, for anyone looking carefully enough, inconsistencies that should have raised serious questions. No one had been looking carefully enough. Preston started looking in August of 2006. By early October, he had retained Gerald Foss, a licensed private investigator out of Augusta, who had confirmed enough of Preston's suspicions to constitute a file. Preston had given himself a deadline: he would bring everything to the Chatham County Sheriff's Office within 72 hours. Eleanor found out. I have spent 18 years wondering how. I have settled on the simplest answer she had never stopped watching. A woman who plans the way Eleanor plans does not let her guard down simply because she feels secure. She monitors the environment, especially then. The medical examiner listed cause of death as blunt force head trauma consistent with a fall. Blood alcohol content was 0.14. The staircase at Sterling Manor is original to the house, white oak, steep by modern standards. It is not a staircase you navigate safely at 0.14. What the report did not address, because there was no particular reason to pursue, it was the precise composition of what Preston had been drinking. In 2006, absent a specific reason to order a full toxicology panel, a high BAC at an accidental fall closed most questions before they were asked. Eleanor understood that. She had understood it once before in Beaufort. I arrived at Sterling Manor 40 minutes after Quarry's call. The rain had been falling since early evening, and the Spanish moss on the oaks along the drive was dark and heavy with it. Inside, the front room smelled of wood smoke and something medicinal that I could not immediately identify. The bourbon glass was on the side table near the sofa, heavy-bottomed, still containing 2 fingers of amber liquid, ice that had not yet fully melted. I looked at it without touching it. I was not a detective, but I had spent 3 decades learning to read documents, and a document is simply a record of what happened. That glass was a record. Eleanor stood near the window. She was crying in the way people cry when they need to be seen doing it, controlled enough to be sustained, distressed enough to prevent conversation. Miles Quarry stood nearby, speaking in the low professional register of a man managing a scene. Julian was on the sofa by the fireplace, 9 years old, wearing plaid pajamas, not crying. Watching. He had Preston's eyes, dark and steady and patient, and when those eyes found mine across the room, something shifted in the center of my chest that I have never been able to name precisely. I walked to the study and told an officer I needed a moment. Preston's sport coat was hanging on the back of the desk chair, the one he had worn to dinner 2 nights before. In the inside breast pocket, folded and refolded until the paper was soft, I found a small piece of notepaper, a phone number. Gerald Foss's number, I would later confirm, and 4 words in Preston's handwriting pressed hard into the paper, as a man writes when he finally understands something he had hoped was not true. She's done it before. I stood in that study while the rain came down, and Eleanor's measured weeping carried through the wall. I held the paper for a long time. Then I put it in my pocket. I did not hand it to the police. Not from fear and not from doubt about what it meant. I kept it because I understood in the particular clarity that comes when everything goes very quiet, that Eleanor would never be caught by ordinary means. She had passed through ordinary means before without leaving a mark. To reach her, I would need patience she had never encountered, preparation she could not anticipate, and time more of it than most men my age would choose to spend. I looked at the rain on the study window and thought about a borrowed pen 41 years ago that was never returned. Now I finally understood why it had never bothered me. People ask me how long it took to plan. The answer is 15 years. Not because I am a slow man, but because I needed to be certain that when Eleanor finally fell, she would never have the means to stand again. Certainty of that kind is not built in weeks or months. It is built the way good archival work is built, one verified document at a time. Each one cross-referenced, each one sealed against challenge. Patience is not weakness. In my experience, patience is the only weapon that has no counter. I knew from the beginning that I could not go to the police. Eleanor had constructed an airtight narrative around Preston's death, a grieving widow, a blood alcohol reading that explained everything, no physical evidence of interference. Gerald Foss was dead within 4 months of Preston, a hit and run on a county road outside Augusta that was never solved. Whatever documentation Foss had assembled died with him. What I had was a folded piece of paper and 41 years of knowing Preston Thorne well enough to understand that he had not been drunk that night by accident. That is not evidence. That is grief dressed up as certainty. To catch Eleanor, I needed her to build the cage herself. My job was simply to hand her the materials. I found Silas Pruitt in Charleston in the spring of 2008. It took me 18 months of quiet research, cross-referencing obituary records, property filings, and probate documents across 3 states to locate a man who matched the pattern. I was looking for someone Eleanor had used and discarded, someone still alive, but effectively invisible. Silas had been Eleanor's second husband, a fact she had never disclosed publicly. He was 43 years old and partially paralyzed on his left side, the result of what his Charleston physician had documented as idiopathic peripheral neuropathy. I knew better. Chronic low-dose arsenic poisoning produces a profile nearly identical to certain neurological disorders, particularly when the treating physician has no reason to suspect deliberate poisoning. When I knocked on his door on a rainy afternoon in April of 2008, Silas opened it 4 inches and looked at me the way a man looks at a stranger when experience has taught him that strangers rarely mean good news. I told him who I was. I told him about Preston. I told him I was not there to ask him to do anything, not yet. I was there because I wanted him to know that someone knew the truth and that someone intended to do something about it. He let me in. We sat in his kitchen for 3 hours. Before I left Charleston that evening, I made 2 arrangements. The first was practical. I contacted a physician I trusted, a private practitioner named Dr. Edmund Hale in Savannah, and arranged for Silas to be examined properly and his medical history formally documented. The second arrangement took longer. Through a legal storage firm in Atlanta, First National Vault, I established a sealed evidence account, hair and nail samples from Silas collected under Dr. Hale's supervision, stored in a notarized evidence container alongside Silas's complete medical file. The chain of custody was established on May 3, 2008, and has remained unbroken since. Whatever a defense attorney might argue 17 years later, they could not argue that the evidence had been manufactured after the fact. The second thing I did for Silas was considerably less legal. Using my access to historical document archives and my familiarity with how death records are filed, stored, and cross-referenced across county systems in Georgia and Tennessee, I constructed a paper trail indicating that a man matching Silas Pruitt's description had died in a vehicle fire on a rural highway outside Knoxville in the fall of 2008. The record was imperfect by design, good enough to satisfy a cursory search, not so elaborate as to invite scrutiny. Eleanor, though I later confirmed, checked it once. She moved on. Silas relocated to a small house on the Isle of Hope outside Savannah and lived quietly under a name I will not record here, tended by a neighbor who asked no questions and received a modest monthly deposit in her bank account that she attributed to a distant family arrangement. I am not proud of what I did for Silas, but I am not ashamed of it either. Julian Thorne turned 18 in the winter of 2015. By then, I had been paying his tuition quietly through a series of routed transfers to a designated account for 7 years. Undergraduate studies at UGA, then the School of Law, $340,000 in total spread across 7 years in amounts calibrated to look on paper like an unremarkable private scholarship. Julian had graduated near the top of his law class. He had never asked where the funding came from. He had been patient in a way that reminded me painfully of his father. I met him at a restaurant on Bull Street in January of 2015. I told him everything. The full account: Preston, Eleanor, Gerald, Foss, Silas, the folded piece of paper I still carried in my desk at Factor's Walk. I watched his face while I talked. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me and said very calmly, "What do you need me to do?" He had Preston's patience. He also had something Preston had never possessed: a precise and unsentimental understanding of how power actually functions inside a courtroom. Victoria came to me in the summer of 2016 with the plan already fully formed. My daughter has always been 3 steps ahead of any room she walks into, a quality she did not inherit from me, but that I have always recognized as the most valuable thing she owns. She laid it out. Simply, Eleanor would investigate any target before moving. If she found a daughter, she would find leverage. The solution was to remove the leverage before it could be used. A mountaineering accident in Nepal, a remote trail in the Annapurna region, documented with the appropriate permits, and an expedition log that placed Victoria at elevation when weather conditions turned severe. No body recovered. The terrain made that plausible. A presumptive death certificate filed in Chatham County. Victoria Sterling, age 23, lost on September 4, 2016. On every public record that Eleanor would ever have access to, I became a man who had outlived his only child. Victoria Mercer. Her mother's maiden name, legally assumed through a court filing in a different jurisdiction, continued her work in cybersecurity without interruption. We communicated through means I will not specify. She attended no family events. She sent no cards. For 3 years, she did not exist to anyone who might be watching. I will not pretend that was easy. I will only say that it was necessary. Silas had asked me that first evening in his Charleston kitchen how long it would take. I had not answered immediately. I looked out his window at the Cooper River moving silently in the April dark, and I thought about Preston. Then I said, "Long enough to be certain." That was 2008. 11 years passed before I was ready. And before I could take the first step toward Eleanor, I had to do the hardest thing I have ever done: disappear from the life of the person I loved most, so that she would be invisible to an enemy who did not yet know she existed. I had studied Eleanor Vane for 13 years before I saw her in person. I had read every document that bore her name, every property filing, every probate record, every newspaper mention. I had assembled a portrait of her, built entirely from paper, the way I had always understood people best. But paper is flat. It does not breathe. It does not move through a room. The Telfair Museum's Spring Gala, April of 2019. The Rotunda Gallery was warm with candlelight, and the particular kind of conversation that happens when wealthy people are comfortable enough to stop performing and simply exist among their own. I arrived at 8:15, accepted a glass of champagne. I had no intention of drinking, and positioned myself near the east wall, where I could see the full length of the room without appearing to watch anything at all. Eleanor arrived at 8:40. She was 50 years old, and carried it with the kind of ease that is not accidental. It is the result of knowing for a very long time exactly the effect you produce when you enter a space. She wore dark green. Her hair was silver at the temples, and she had not tried to conceal it. She moved through the room, slowly pausing at intervals, her attention appearing to rest on the art, while her eyes did something considerably more systematic. I recognized the pattern immediately. I had seen it described in Gerald Foss's notes, which I had eventually reconstructed from secondary sources. She was cataloging. Every pause was an assessment. I had waited 13 years for this moment. Standing there with an untouched glass of champagne, I felt nothing that I had expected to feel. No rage, no fear, only the particular stillness that comes when preparation finally meets its purpose. There is a question I anticipated from the beginning, and I will address it plainly. Why did Eleanor not recognize me? The answer is that I had made certain she never had reason to. At Preston's funeral in October of 2006, I sat in the last row of the church on Abercorn Street, and I did not approach the family section. I did not introduce myself to Eleanor. I did not speak to the pastor or to any of Preston's business associates within her line of sight. I was to anyone observing, simply one of the many acquaintances that a man like Preston accumulates over a lifetime, a face in the back row, present and unremarkable. Eleanor, I was certain, had other priorities that afternoon. In the 13 years that followed, I made a deliberate effort to remain invisible within any context that might connect me to Preston Thorne. I declined invitations to events honoring his memory. I gave no interviews when Thorne Properties was sold and restructured. My name appeared nowhere in the coverage of his estate. To the social world of Savannah, Arthur Sterling was a quiet archivist with a respectable portfolio and no particular story attached to him. To Eleanor specifically, I was at best a name she might have encountered once in a property document. What I gave her in the months before the gala was a reason to look more carefully. Through carefully placed mentions in the circles, Eleanor was known to frequent a word at a charity board meeting, a reference in a newsletter for a Savannah Historical Preservation Society. I allowed the figure of Arthur Sterling and his $47 million in real estate and investments to drift naturally into her awareness. A lonely widower, no surviving children, no close family. A man of considerable means, and apparently no plan for what would happen to those means when he was gone. I was the most legible target she had ever been offered. She approached me at 9:20 near a landscape painting on the north wall that neither of us was actually looking at. Her opening was graceful and unremarkable, a comment about the painting, delivered with the precise calibration of someone who had spent years understanding which register of voice makes a person feel both noticed and comfortable. I responded simply. I did not lead. I let her set the direction of every exchange the way a good archivist learns to let a document reveal itself, rather than forcing an interpretation. At some point in the first 15 minutes, she said something that stopped the breath in my chest for exactly 2 seconds. I find that the older I get, the more I value people who are simply present, not performing. Just there. Preston had told me in the summer of 2005 that Eleanor had said something very nearly identical to him within the first hour of their meeting. He had found it disarming. He had told me it was one of the things that made her feel different from other people he had known. I had written it down in a notebook I still kept in my desk at Factor's Walk, because even then, something about it had seemed too precise to be spontaneous. Standing in the Rotunda Gallery hearing it again, I understood that Eleanor did not seduce people. She reproduced conditions. She had a script, not a rigid one, but a set of calibrated instruments she deployed when the environment warranted it. Preston had encountered those instruments and had no framework for understanding what they were. I had spent 15 years building that framework. I nodded and said that I agreed. I said that I had spent most of my adult life around documents and found that they too rewarded patience over performance. Eleanor smiled at that. It was a practiced smile, but there was something underneath it, a flicker of genuine interest. Or perhaps the particular satisfaction of a woman who believes she has correctly identified what she is dealing with. She had. She simply had the wrong definition of what I was. I later learned, through a source I had cultivated within Savannah's private investigator community, that Eleanor retained someone within 10 days of the gala to run a full background review on Arthur Sterling. The results she received were exactly the results I had designed. Wife Margaret Sterling, née Alderton, deceased. 2009 pancreatic cancer. One child, Victoria Sterling, deceased 2016 mountaineering accident, Annapurna region, Nepal, no remains recovered. Assets: real estate holdings, antique inventory, investment accounts, aggregate value approximately $47 million. No outstanding legal matters. No living relatives. I was on paper the loneliest wealthy man in Chatham County. Eleanor moved forward. Near the end of the evening, she tilted her head slightly and asked with the tone of a woman who already knows the answer, "Do you believe in second chances, Mr. Sterling?" I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "I believe that people receive exactly what they deserve, Mrs. Vane." She smiled and said she found that a very hopeful philosophy. She did not hear what I had actually said. 6 months later, we were engaged. The night before our wedding, I sat alone at my desk on Factor's Walk, with a photograph of Preston Thorne propped against the lamp, and I told him quietly that I was about to walk into the house where he had died, that the trap had already been set, and that the woman who had never looked closely enough at the man standing in the back row of her husband's funeral was about to spend the rest of her life understanding what that had cost her. Marriage, in my experience, is a document like any other. It has a surface text and a subtext, and the two are rarely the same. The surface text of my marriage to Eleanor Sterling, as it appeared to the dinner guests, the charity committee members, the neighbors along Forsyth Park, was unremarkable in the best possible way. A quiet older man and his elegant wife, well matched in temperament, settled comfortably into the rhythms of a large house and a small social world. We were invited to things. We attended some of them. People told us we seemed well suited. The subtext was a different document entirely. Khloe arrived at Sterling Manor in January of 2023, weeks after the wedding, with 6 suitcases and the absolute certainty of a person who has never once been required to make herself agreeable to anyone she did not choose. She was 24 years old and had built a social media following of approximately 380,000 people by filming herself in other people's spaces and commenting on them with the bright, merciless energy of someone who has confused cruelty for wit. Within her first week, she filmed a walkthrough of Sterling Manor's library, 1,400 books, some of them dating to the early 19th century, and described it on camera as the world's saddest hoard. She referred to me in the third person in my own house as the old man. Not unkindly exactly, with the particular indifference of someone who does not consider you worth the effort of unkindness. I catalogued her behavior the way I catalog everything, methodically, without judgment, and with the understanding that documentation is not the same as reaction. From the first month of our marriage, I played a man in physical decline. This required more sustained discipline than any other part of the plan. I worked with a private physician, a practitioner I had known for many years, and trusted with certain categories of information to construct a medical profile that would satisfy Eleanor's scrutiny, without requiring anything verifiable by an independent specialist. Mild but progressive cardiac irregularity. Hypertension that responded inconsistently to medication. A prognosis that stated carefully and without alarm, suggested a natural life expectancy somewhere in the 5 to 7 year range. I took pills in front of Eleanor at breakfast. I excused myself from walks I was perfectly capable of completing. I allowed myself to appear tired at dinner parties in a way that invited sympathetic glances from other guests, and more importantly, from Eleanor herself. I was not performing weakness, I was performing the idea of weakness, which is a different thing and requires a different kind of attention. Eleanor believed me. I am certain of this not because she said so, but because of what she did not do. A woman who had poisoned one husband and waited out another had excellent instincts for identifying the most efficient path to an outcome. For 4 years, she did not move against me. She was patient. She was comfortable. She was waiting for a process she believed was already underway to reach its natural conclusion. She did not need to act. She simply needed to wait. That calculation, her decision to wait, was the calculation I had designed for her to make. Percival and I began installing the recording equipment in the second month of our marriage. Georgia law, specifically OCGA. Section 161162 permits the recording of conversations in a private residence when at least one party to the conversation consents. As the owner of Sterling Manor and a party to every conversation held within it, I consented. Over the following months, we embedded 47 small audio devices into ordinary objects throughout the house. A lamp base in the sitting room, a bookend in the study, a clock mechanism in the upstairs hallway. Victoria, operating under her working identity remotely through a secure server, she had configured herself, received and archived every file automatically. Nothing was stored locally. Nothing could be found. In early 2024, I changed the conditions. I began appearing healthier. Not dramatically. I did not want Eleanor to feel deceived before I was ready. But I walked further in the mornings. I declined the pill I usually took at breakfast with a comment about feeling steadier lately. I sat up straighter at the dinner table. Small things. Observed things. At the same time, I asked Percival to become careless in a single specific way. During a conversation he had with Eleanor in the kitchen, a conversation he allowed her to believe she had overheard by accident, he mentioned in passing that I had recently requested a meeting with my estate attorney, and that he had heard the name of a charitable foundation mentioned in connection with the appointment. Eleanor heard it. I know she heard it because her behavior changed within 48 hours in ways that a person trained to read documents or people could not miss. On an evening in June of 2024, the device inside the upstairs hallway clock recorded Eleanor on the telephone in the master bedroom. I was standing 6 feet from the closed door. I was not breathing loudly. Her voice was the voice I had first heard in the Rotunda Gallery in 2019, calibrated, precise, stripped of warmth. She asked the person on the other end about the timeline. She used the phrase "natural causes" twice. She did not mention my name. She did not need to. I counted my own heartbeats in the hallway and waited until I heard her end the call. Then I walked downstairs, poured a glass of water I did not drink, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the January dark outside the garden. That night, I sent a message to a number that officially belonged to no one living. Victoria called me back within the hour. "We need to move faster," I told her. "She's planning." There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of someone who has been waiting for this sentence for a long time. "How do you want to start?" she asked. I told her. Before we could reach Eleanor, we needed Khloe to make a mistake. A public one large enough and documented enough to begin pulling the foundation out from under both of them. And I already knew exactly where Khloe was most likely to make it. The Telfair Museums in September look the way Savannah always promises to look, and rarely delivers all at once, warm light coming through tall windows. A string quartet playing something unhurried near the east wall. The smell of magnolia drifting in from the garden every time a door opened onto the terrace. 200 guests in evening clothes, the kind of crowd that knows how to occupy a beautiful room without disturbing it. I had attended this gala every year for 2 decades. I had served on the Telfair board since 2004. I knew the caterers by name and the parking arrangements by habit, and I knew standing near the entrance at 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening in September of 2024 that I was not here for the art or the conversation. I was here because this was the room where Khloe would make her mistake. She had been live streaming since before we arrived. I had watched her in the car, Eleanor in the front seat speaking quietly with the driver, Khloe in the back, with her phone at arm's length, narrating the evening to an audience I gathered numbered somewhere in the mid-hundreds of thousands. She described the drive through Forsyth Park. She described her dress. She described Sterling Manor, which she called the family estate, without any indication that the estate in question belonged to a man she had publicly referred to, on at least 3 documented occasions, as a temporary arrangement. Inside the rotunda gallery, she continued, she moved through the room with the particular confidence of someone who believes the camera in their hand makes them the most interesting object in any space they enter. She stopped at a Telfair landscape and filmed it for 11 seconds before moving on. She filmed the champagne. She filmed herself accepting it. I found a position near the north wall where I could observe the room without appearing to do so, a skill I had developed over 30 years of working in archives, where the ability to be present without being noticed is professionally essential. Percival stood 20 feet to my left, near the catering station, with the expression of a man waiting for nothing in particular. The moment came at approximately 9 o'clock. A woman I recognized, a board member's wife named Carolyn, pleasant and unremarkable in equal measure, stopped Khloe near the center of the room. I could not hear the exchange from where I stood, but I could read the direction of it. Carolyn gestured toward me, clearly asking something in my direction. Khloe followed her gesture with a glance, then turned back to Carolyn with a smile. What she said next, she said to a live streaming camera with approximately 340,000 viewers and 1 investigative journalist standing close enough to catch every word without straining. Oh, him. He's just an old man who collects dust and old paper. He's my mother's retirement plan. The group around her, 4 people, 2 of whom I had never seen before, laughed with the ease of an audience that has been given permission to laugh. Khloe moved on without looking in my direction again. Willa Sorrento was standing 6 feet from Khloe when it happened. I had not arranged for Willa to be there. She covered Savannah society and arts events as a matter of professional routine, and the Telfair Gala was exactly the kind of thing she attended without being asked. But I had known she was on the guest list, and I had known that Khloe, given sufficient audience and sufficient comfort, would eventually say out loud what she had always said in smaller rooms. Some things do not need to be arranged. They only need to be anticipated. I stood at the north wall and watched it happen, and felt nothing that I allowed to reach my face. Julian arrived at 9:20. I had not seen him in person for 6 weeks, and the particular quality of his stillness, Preston's stillness, the same patience worn on a younger frame, steadied something in me that the previous hour had made unsteady. He entered through the main gallery doors in a dark suit, accepted a glass of water from a passing tray, and began moving through the room with the unhurried manner of a man who belongs somewhere and knows it. He reached Khloe at 9:31. I watched him introduce himself, a slight inclination of the head, a card produced from his jacket pocket with the economy of motion that lawyers develop when they have learned that confidence is most effective when it is quiet. Khloe's posture changed within 15 seconds. The camera came down. She turned to face him with the full attention she had not given a single other person in the room that evening. Julian Thorne, the card said, was a partner at a firm on Bull Street, specializing in brand development and talent contracts. He told her I could read enough of it from the distance, an interest in working with content creators who had outgrown their current representation. Khloe had outgrown her current representation. She had in fact been discussing the problem with Eleanor for the better part of 6 months. Julian said the right things in the right order. He had always been good at that. Eleanor was standing near the far end of the room when Julian and Khloe began their conversation. I watched her notice it, a brief shift of attention, a moment of assessment, and then a small expression of satisfaction. She saw what she expected to see her daughter networking with an attractive and apparently successful professional. She turned back to her own conversation. She did not recognize Julian. There was no reason she would. He had been 9 years old and sitting in pajamas on a sofa the last time they were in the same room together. And in the intervening 25 years, he had chosen quietly and deliberately to reclaim his father's surname The one name Eleanor had never thought to connect to the 9-year-old boy she had left sitting on a sofa in plaid pajamas the night Preston died, and built a career in a city Eleanor had never had occasion to investigate closely. At 9:45, I set my champagne glass down on a passing tray and walked toward the terrace doors. Percival fell into step beside me without being summoned. Outside, the garden was cooler than the gallery, and the magnolia smell was stronger in the open air. The sounds of the party came through the glass behind us, muffled and warm. I did not look back immediately. When I spoke, I kept my voice at the level appropriate for a private conversation on a crowded terrace, low and even without urgency. "She called Victoria," I said. "Tell her the clock starts tonight." Percival nodded once and said nothing. I stood at the terrace door for a long moment before going back inside. Through the glass, the room arranged itself the way rooms do when you observe them from outside, flattened, lit. The people moving through it like figures in a diorama. Khloe was laughing at something Julian had said. Her head tilted at the angle people use when they want to appear charmed rather than simply interested. Eleanor was shaking hands with a man near the bar. The string quartet had shifted to something with a faster tempo. Everything looked entirely normal. That was, I knew exactly how it was supposed to look. Julian Thorne was standing in a room with the woman who did not know she owed him a debt she could not repay. The clock was running, and no one in that beautiful, well-lit room had any idea that the most important event of the evening had already happened quietly, as important things so often do without anyone noticing at all. I was not present for any of it. That was, of course, by design. Julian reported to me through Percival brief written summaries, delivered every few days, precise and unadorned. The kind of documentation a good attorney produces when he understands that the record matters as much as the event. Victoria Mercer sent her updates through a channel I will not describe in detail, at intervals that told me she was monitoring the situation closely without crowding it. What I knew of the weeks between the Telfair Gala and the second week of October, I knew the way I know most things through paper, through reports, through the careful assembly of second-hand observation into something that begins to resemble a complete picture. Julian Thorne is the finest attorney I have ever known. Not because he is exceptionally intelligent, though he is. Because he understands that trust is not built with words. It is built with results, delivered consistently at the moment they are needed most. The first thing Julian did was solve a problem Khloe already had. She had been represented for the previous 14 months by a talent management firm out of Nashville that had placed her in a promotional contract with a mid-tier cosmetics brand. A contract that, on closer examination, contained a non-compete clause broad enough to restrict her from working with any comparable brand in the continental United States for a period of 3 years following termination. It was not a catastrophic clause, but it was a limiting one, and Khloe had been attempting to negotiate out of it without success for the better part of 6 months. Julian reviewed the contract within 48 hours of the gala. He found 3 points of enforceability concern ambiguous definitions, inconsistent jurisdiction language, a consideration clause that had not been properly executed, and within 10 days he had delivered a formal letter to the Nashville firm's legal counsel that effectively rendered the non-compete unenforceable. The Nashville firm did not contest it. Khloe called him the morning after she received the news. Julian later told Percival in his characteristically understated way that she had been enthusiastic. He had not charged her for the work. 3 weeks of small professional interactions followed. A phone call about a brand partnership inquiry from a company in Austin. A brief meeting at his office on Bull Street to review a sponsorship agreement she had been offered. Julian was helpful, precise, and entirely appropriate. He did not push. He did not suggest anything beyond what was professionally warranted. He allowed Khloe to reach her own conclusions about him, because he understood, as Preston had never quite learned, that the most durable impressions are the ones a person forms without feeling guided toward them. In the 4th week, he invited her to dinner at the Old Pink House on Chippewa Square. The Old Pink House is the kind of Savannah institution that does not need to announce what it is, a colonial-era building, low lighting, the kind of menu that does not require explanation. It is not a place people go to discuss contracts. Khloe understood that. She went anyway. By the end of the evening, according to the summary Percival delivered to me 2 days later, the conversation had covered topics considerably outside the scope of brand development law. Julian was careful. He always was. But he was also Preston's son, and Preston had possessed a quality that I had spent 40 years failing to adequately describe, a genuine attentiveness that made the person across the table feel without effort or performance that they were the most interesting thing in the room. Julian had inherited it. In him, it was sharpened by 20 years of legal training into something considerably more precise. Khloe did not stand a chance. But then she was not supposed to. The contract arrived in the second week of October. Vanguard Creative Group was a legitimately registered limited liability company incorporated in Georgia. Its articles of organization filed with the Georgia Secretary of State's office in March of 2023. Its registered agent was a law firm in Atlanta. Its managing member on the public record was a woman named Victoria Mercer. The company's stated purpose was talent representation and brand development for digital content creators. Everything about it was exactly what it appeared to be, except for one clause in Appendix D of a 47-page agreement written in the standard language of intellectual property assignment that specified the following. In consideration of the compensation described herein, the talent irrevocably and in perpetuity assigns to Vanguard Creative Group all rights to the talent's name, likeness, image, personal brand, and associated intellectual property, including but not limited to trademark registrations, domain names, and social media handles, effective upon execution of this agreement. It was not hidden. It was in the document. It was under Georgia contract law and the broader framework of federal intellectual property statute entirely enforceable. A perpetual rights assignment of this nature is standard in certain entertainment industry contracts. Recording deals, for instance, have contained comparable language for decades. The consideration, $3.2 million over 3 years, with a deposit of $320,000 payable upon signing, was substantial enough to constitute valid and adequate value exchanged. Julian had explained the broad structure of the contract to Khloe at a follow-up meeting at his office. He had not explained Appendix D in detail. He had provided the document as required, with sufficient time for review. He had recommended, as he later confirmed in writing, that she consult independent counsel before signing. She had not consulted independent counsel. On the afternoon of October 11, 2024, Khloe Vane signed the Vanguard agreement at Julian's office on Bull Street, took a photograph of the deposit check, $320,000, made out in her name, and posted it to her account before she had left the building. The caption read, "New era. Bigger moves. Stay tuned." Julian walked her to the elevator. He shook her hand. He went back to his office and sent a 2-word message to Victoria Mercer. "It's done." Every time Julian looked at Khloe Vane, at her ease, her confidence, the way she moved through a room as though consequence was something that happened to other people, he thought about a man he had known only from photographs and from one careful, 3-hour conversation at a restaurant on Bull Street when he was 18 years old. He did not hate Khloe. Hating her would have required him to believe she understood what her mother had cost the world, and he did not believe that. She was careless and self-regarding and had never been given any particular reason to be otherwise. But he understood something that she did not. The children of people who do damage are not always innocent bystanders. Sometimes they are the mechanism through which the damage continues. And the price of that, when it finally came due, was not personal. It was contractual. Victoria's message reached me at Factor's Walk at 4:17 in the afternoon. I read it once, set the phone face down on my desk, and looked out the window at the river. The water was the color it always is in October, dark green, moving slowly, indifferent to everything happening along its banks. I thought about Preston for exactly as long as I allowed myself to think about him at any given moment. Then I stood up, put on my jacket, and began the drive back to Sterling Manor. Eleanor would be in the sitting room. She always was at that hour reading or appearing to read while she thought about things she did not discuss with me. I had watched her do it for 4 years, and understood in the way you understand a document you have studied carefully exactly what she was thinking about. She was thinking about timelines, about natural causes, about a man who had inconveniently begun to look healthier than his medical file suggested he should. She had been patient long enough. And somewhere in the sitting room of a house she had not paid for, she was deciding that patience was no longer the most efficient strategy available to her. I had studied Eleanor long enough to understand one fundamental truth about her. She does not act out of love, and she does not act out of patience alone. She acts when she sees an opening, a clear, unobstructed path between herself and what she wants. Every crime she had ever committed had been constructed around that principle. Preston had been an opening. Silas had been an opening. And I had spent 5 years making myself look like the most convenient opening she had ever been offered. In the 3rd week of October, I gave her the door and stepped deliberately through it. The morning of October 21st, I came downstairs at my usual time, crossed the front parlor of Sterling Manor, and allowed my left leg to buckle at the precise point I had selected 6 feet from the settee, close enough to the side table that the sound of my arm catching it would carry. Percival was in the hallway. He had been there since 7:15, waiting for the sound. He called emergency services at 8:43. His voice, when he spoke to the dispatcher, carried the exact quality of controlled alarm, appropriate to a man of his temperament, witnessing something frightening. He was not performing. Percival has never performed anything in his life. He was simply, as he always is, exactly what the situation required. Eleanor and Khloe arrived at Savannah Memorial 40 minutes after I did. The physician overseeing my care, a man I had known professionally for 11 years and trusted with a category of information that required both discretion and nerve, had communicated my condition to the family in the manner we had discussed. Cautious, non-committal, weighted with the particular gravity that medical professionals deploy when they wish to convey seriousness without making claims they cannot later defend. He spoke of indicators and monitoring and uncertainty. He did not say stroke. He did not need to. Eleanor filled in the word herself, which was precisely the point. They sat in the room for 2 hours. Eleanor held my hand. Khloe sat near the window with her phone face down in her lap, a restraint that I suspected cost her considerably more effort than it appeared to. The nurses noted, to each other and to the physician, what attentive and concerned family members they were. I kept my eyes mostly closed and my breathing measured. I had been practicing the breathing for 3 weeks. They returned to Sterling Manor that evening. The recording devices in the sitting room and the upstairs hallway were operational, as they had been continuously for 4 years. What they captured between 9:45 and 11:30 that night required no interpretation. Eleanor spoke first, and she spoke with the efficiency of a person who has been waiting to have a particular conversation and is relieved to finally be having it. She discussed the structure of Arthur's holdings, the real estate portfolio, the investment accounts, the antique inventory at Factor's Walk, with an accuracy that confirmed she had been studying them for some time. She mentioned the name of my estate attorney unprompted. She used the phrase "the transition" 4 times in 40 minutes. Khloe asked at one point how long the process of transferring Sterling Manor's title typically took in Georgia. Eleanor told her calmly and correctly that it depended on the instruments in place, but that with the right authorizations, certain things could move quite quickly. I listened to the recording the following morning and felt nothing that surprised me. I had built the room they were speaking in. I had installed the device that captured them. I had engineered, over 5 years, every condition that had made that conversation feel to them like a private one. On the 3rd day, Eleanor arrived at the hospital with a manila folder. Inside, It was a durable power of attorney document, Georgia compliant, properly formatted, witnessed, and notarized. It was on its face exactly what it appeared to be, an instrument that would grant Eleanor authority to manage my financial and legal affairs during a period of incapacity. What she did not know was that Percival had substituted the folder on the bedside table before she entered the room. The document Arthur Sterling signed that morning with a trembling hand and a barely audible signature contained an automatic revocation clause, rendering it void after 30 days, drafted by Julian Thorne and reviewed by a second attorney in Charleston. More importantly, the assets Eleanor believed she was gaining access to had been placed in their entirety into an irrevocable trust in 2017, 3 years before our marriage. A power of attorney, regardless of its scope, has no authority over assets held in an irrevocable trust. Eleanor had studied my finances carefully. She had simply studied the version I had shown her. She left the hospital looking satisfied. I watched her go through half-closed eyes and said nothing. While I was in the hospital, Victoria Mercer was working. Vanguard Creative Group's legal team, a boutique intellectual property firm in Atlanta retained under Victoria Mercer's direction, had spent the 2 weeks following Khloe's signing preparing a comprehensive set of takedown notices. Under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, a rights holder may submit formal notifications to online platforms identifying content that infringes their ownership. Vanguard now held perpetual rights to Khloe Vane's name likeness and associated brand identity. Every post Khloe had published after October 11th, the date of the contract's execution, constituted under the agreement's terms unauthorized use of intellectual property belonging to Vanguard. The notices went out on October 23rd. Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube each received a 2-part submission, formal DMCA takedown requests, covering Khloe's copyrighted video content, which Vanguard now owned under the contract's IP assignment clause, and separate trademark-based infringement reports filed under each platform's intellectual property reporting system, asserting Vanguard's contractual rights over the assigned brand name and likeness. The Atlanta firm had prepared both instruments in parallel. The platforms processed each under their standard procedures. Within 72 hours, Khloe's accounts were restricted pending review. By the end of the 4th day, 2 of the 3 had moved to full suspension. 11 brand partnership contracts contained performance clauses. When Khloe's combined reach dropped below threshold, the clauses activated automatically. She called Eleanor on the afternoon of October 26th. I was in the hospital bed. I heard Eleanor's phone ring on the chair beside me, watched her read the screen, and observed her walk into the hallway with the careful composure of a woman who does not allow herself to be seen losing control. Through the partially open door, I could hear Khloe's voice, thin and high, and entirely unlike her usual register, asking what was happening and what she was supposed to do. I closed my eyes. For the first time and longer than I could precisely calculate, I allowed the corners of my mouth to move in a direction that was not neutral. Eleanor was managing damage she did not yet fully understand for a daughter she had always believed was untouchable. The irony was that the real damage, the damage being prepared with considerably more care, was not directed at Khloe at all. It was directed at Eleanor herself, and it would not arrive from outside. It would arrive from inside the house she had spent 5 years trying to take from me. She was going to find it herself, in her own time, with her own hands. I had made sure of that. I have lived in Sterling Manor for 30 years. I know every corner of that house the way a man knows the contents of a document he has read 10,000 times. Not just the words, but the weight of the paper, the particular way the light falls across a certain page at a certain hour. I knew which floorboard creaked 3 steps from the bottom of the back staircase. I knew that the library's east wall produced a faint echo when the barometric pressure dropped before rain. And I knew, with the same quiet certainty, that Eleanor had been searching the house for weeks, opening drawers she had no business in, running her fingers along shelves under the pretense of dusting. asking Percival questions about the basement, with a casualness so deliberate it was almost admirable. I had let her search. I had been waiting for the right moment to let her find. The recording from the night of October 29th begins at 11:47 in the evening. I was not at Sterling Manor. I was in a private room at Savannah Memorial, lying in a hospital bed I did not need, listening to the playback through a secure connection Victoria Mercer had configured months earlier. The audio quality was excellent. It always was. Eleanor had been thorough. The devices in the sitting room captured her moving through the ground floor for nearly an hour before she reached the library, the sound of desk drawers opening and closing, the soft percussion of her fingers working methodically through files she had located in the cabinet behind the writing desk. She was looking for the will. She was looking for the trust documents. She was looking for anything that would tell her how much time she had left before Arthur Sterling's estate became something she could not touch. What she found instead was the library's east wall. Percival had left the house that afternoon on my instructions, and before departing, he had done one specific thing. He had replaced the third volume from the left. On the second shelf from the floor, a collection of Georgia property surveys from the 1890s, approximately 4 inches further right than its proper position. It was a small displacement, noticeable only to someone running a hand along the shelf in the dark, feeling for the edge of the bookcase rather than looking at it. Eleanor found it at 12:31 in the morning, based on the timestamp of the recording device embedded in the clock on the library's mantel. The sound that follows on the recording is the soft mechanical release of a latch, then the groan of a door that opens on a descending staircase. She went down. I had spent 3 years preparing that room, not decorating it, preparing it. Every document in it had been sourced, verified, and placed with the understanding that Eleanor would eventually stand in front of it, and that what she saw needed to be accurate enough to be undeniable, and complete enough to be devastating. The left wall held 3 accordion files, each labeled with a name. Her first husband, the contractor from Beaufort. A second man older from outside Charlotte, whom I had identified through probate records in 2011. Preston Thorne. Each file contained property documents, financial records, medical examiner reports, and where available, the investigative notes of private practitioners who had looked at these deaths and found them troubling without ever finding enough to act on. The right wall held 2 items. The first was a manila folder containing photographs of Silas Pruitt, not from 2006, but recent. Silas at the Isle of Hope house. Silas in the small garden he had planted in the years since Eleanor had last seen him. Alive, plainly, and documented. Beside the photographs was a medical summary prepared by Dr. Edmund Hale, identifying the source of Silas's neurological condition as chronic arsenic exposure, dated and signed and notarized in 2008. The second item on the right wall was a single file folder thicker than the others labeled in my handwriting, with Eleanor's full name and the year 1998. She had been 29 years old in 1998. I had wanted her to understand that I had known about her for longer than she had known about me. The center table held one additional item, a photograph unframed set face up under a small lamp I had left running. It was taken in Athens, Georgia in the spring of 1985. 2 men in their late 30s standing outside the main library on the UGA campus. They were not looking at the camera with particular seriousness. It had the quality of a photograph taken between other things, the way photographs taken by friends usually do. On the back, in ink that had faded but remained legible, was a caption in my own handwriting. Arthur Sterling and Preston Thorne, Athens, Georgia, April 1985. The recording captures what happens next with a precision I could not have scripted. A sharp intake of breath, a sound that might be the photograph being set back down or might be something else, then the heavier sound of a file folder hitting the stone floor, then nothing. 47 seconds of complete silence. I have listened to those 47 seconds many times since. I believe they are the sound of a woman who has spent 30 years operating on the assumption that she understood the situation, realizing in the space of a single moment that she had never understood it at all. On the table beside the photograph was a sealed envelope. Inside a single sheet of paper, handwritten. "Hello, Eleanor. I've been waiting a long time for this." She did not leave the house. She did not call anyone that night. The recording confirms it. She stayed in the room for 22 minutes after opening the envelope, then climbed back upstairs and went to bed. She was not fleeing. She was thinking. A woman like Eleanor cornered does not run. She calculates. She had no access to the assets she needed. The account transfers remained incomplete. The power of attorney she believed she held was already dissolving on its 30-day clock. She could not confront me directly without revealing what she had found, and more dangerously, confirming that she understood its implications. She had one move left, and it was the same move she had always made when the walls closed in. She would act before I could. Percival called me at 11 o'clock. That night he had reviewed the recordings remotely from a location I had arranged for him. "She found it," he said. "Good," I told him. "Now we watch what she does next." I set the phone down on the hospital bedside table and looked at the ceiling for a long time. I had spent 18 years building toward this. Eleanor now knew exactly who I was and exactly how long I had been watching. And knowing that being certain of it would push her toward the one action she believed she could still take cleanly. She was going to come back to that hospital room. She was going to come back with something in her hand that she was confident would solve every problem she had. All I needed was for her to put it near the IV line. Before I tell you what happened on the night of November 15th, the night 18 years of preparation either worked or did not leave one word in the comments. Just one. Caught or escaped. Tell me what you think Eleanor deserved. I will read every single one. And fair warning, what comes next is the part of this story I have thought about the longest. And it does not go the way most people expect. Eleanor Vane had killed 3 people. Each time with patience, precision, and the right compound, delivered in the right quantity, at the right moment. She was not a violent woman. In any conventional sense, she did not rage, did not threaten, did not leave the kind of evidence that violence tends to produce. She understood, at a level that most people never reach, that the cleanest death is the one that requires no explanation. A man with a compromised heart, a documented history of cardiac irregularity, found unresponsive in a hospital bed in the early hours of the morning, that is not a crime scene. That is a sad conclusion to a medical file. She had built that medical file herself over 5 years, one observed symptom at a time. What she did not know was that I had been building something else entirely. The recording devices at Sterling Manor captured Eleanor's 3 days of preparation with the same fidelity they had captured everything else. She did not panic. She did not make calls she should not have made. She moved through the house with the composure of a woman who has faced cornered situations before and has learned that composure is the only reliable asset available in them. She studied the nursing schedule at Savannah Memorial. I later confirmed she had obtained it through a contact at the hospital's administrative office, a request framed as a family member wanting to ensure consistent care. She identified an 11-minute window between the 2:15 and 2:26 rounds on the overnight shift. She chose potassium chloride. It was, from a forensic standpoint, a sophisticated choice. Potassium is a naturally occurring electrolyte present in every human body. In normal concentrations, it is unremarkable. In high concentrations delivered directly into the bloodstream, it causes cardiac arrest within minutes. And unless a pathologist has specific reason to run a targeted electrolyte panel and compare results against the patient's baseline, the cause of death reads as cardiac failure. In a 68-year-old man with a documented history of heart irregularity, no one would have specific reason to look. Eleanor had done her research. She always did. She arrived at Savannah Memorial at 2:11 on the morning of November 15th. She used the family access card the hospital had issued her in October. When Arthur Sterling's condition had first been described to staff as uncertain. The overnight nurse at the third-floor station noted her arrival in the visitor log, a detail that would matter considerably in the weeks ahead, and waved her through without stopping her. A concerned wife visiting her ailing husband in the small hours was not an unusual occurrence. The room was dim. The equipment produced its ordinary sounds, the soft rhythm of a cardiac monitor, the low mechanical hum of the IV stand. Arthur Sterling appeared to be asleep. She worked quickly. The vial came from her coat pocket. She uncapped it, located the injection port on the IV line, a standard Y-site connector, positioned midway along the tubing, and inserted the needle with the steadiness of someone who had, at some point, learned exactly how this was done. She depressed the plunger. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the IV line had been modified. 3 weeks earlier, the physician overseeing Arthur's care had performed what the nursing staff understood to be a routine equipment adjustment. What he had actually installed between the IV bag and the Y-site connector was an inline sampling chamber, a medical-grade device approximately the size of a thumb, designed to capture and retain a small volume of any fluid passing through the line at the point of injection. The IV bag itself had been replaced with a bag of normal, saline, sterile, harmless, chemically inert. Whatever Eleanor introduced into that line would go into the chamber. Nothing from that point would reach Arthur's bloodstream. The chamber sealed automatically upon contact with the injected compound. It was removed by the physician within 90 seconds of Eleanor withdrawing the needle labeled with the date time, and chain of custody documentation prepared in advance and handed to Miles Quarry. The lights came on. Arthur Sterling sat up in the hospital bed. It was, he later reflected, the most satisfying single movement he had made in 5 years. Eleanor turned. Her face passed through several expressions very quickly, before settling on nothing, the particular blankness of a person whose mind is moving faster than their features can follow. Percival was in the chair in the corner of the room, where he had been since midnight, still and quiet, in the way he was always still and quiet. 2 plainclothes detectives stood in the doorway. Miles Quarry stepped forward from beside the window where he had been standing for the past 40 minutes. The hospital's security camera in the hallway outside had recorded Eleanor's arrival, her entry into the room, and the timestamp of every movement. A second camera interior had recorded the rest. Quarry held up his badge. He said her name. He told her she had the right to remain silent. Eleanor looked at the sealed evidence bag in his other hand, the sampling chamber already labeled, already documented. She looked at it for a long time. Julian Thorne appeared in the doorway behind the detectives. He was carrying 2 folders. The first contained the relevant provision of Arthur Sterling's will, a clause specifying that any action taken with intent to cause the testator's death would result in the immediate and total forfeiture of all inheritance rights and the automatic transfer of the estate to the Preston Thorne Memorial Trust, effective upon arrest. The second folder contained a petition for prejudgment asset attachment, prepared under Georgia Code, Section 18-3-1, already signed by a Chatham County judge who had been available by phone at 1:30 that morning. Eleanor's accounts would be frozen before she reached the county detention center. Arthur looked at her across the room. He had thought about this moment for 18 years, and he had decided sometime in the past several months that he did not want it to be large. He wanted it to be accurate. "Preston Thorne sends his regards," he said. Eleanor said nothing. They put the handcuffs on her, and she did not resist, and she did not speak. And the last thing she looked at before they walked her out of the room was the small, sealed chamber in the evidence bag, the thing that had turned her most reliable instrument against her. I watched the door close behind her and sat with the silence for a moment. Julian remained in the room. He set the second folder on the bedside table and looked at me with the expression of a man who has just completed something that cannot be undone and is not entirely sure how to occupy his face in the aftermath. "The accounts are frozen as of 2:47, he said. I nodded. The second set of filings, I said. Not Eleanor's. He understood. He picked up the folder and walked back out into the hallway. The night was not finished. It had only reached the end of its first half. There is something I have thought about often in the months since, something that does not fit neatly into the account of what Eleanor deserved and what she received. Eleanor had spent 28 years teaching Khloe that the world existed to accommodate her. That money was a tool, not a responsibility. That other people's discomfort was essentially irrelevant. She had raised a daughter in her own image. And the cruelest thing about that, the part that kept me awake on more than one occasion, was that Khloe had never been given the chance to become anything else. The disaster that arrived on the morning of November 16th was not only Eleanor's making, but Khloe would be the one standing in the wreckage. Willa Sorrento's article ran in the Savannah Morning News at 6:47 in the morning. It was thorough. She had been working on it, I later learned, for several weeks, cross-referencing public records, the probate filings from Beaufort County, the property documents from Eleanor's second marriage, and the statement that Silas Pruitt's physician had agreed to provide once the arrest had been made. By the time most of Savannah's residents finished their first cup of coffee, they knew Eleanor Vane's full name, her 3 previous husbands, the condition in which Silas Pruitt had been found in 2008, and the charges she was facing. The article did not mention Arthur Sterling by name beyond the basic facts of the arrest. He had asked Willa to keep it that way, and she had agreed. Julian filed the civil action at 8:15 the same morning, before Eleanor had been processed through the Chatham County Detention Center's intake procedure. The suit was brought on behalf of the Preston Thorne Memorial Trust against Eleanor Vane, seeking $18.7 million in compensatory and punitive damages across 3 categories. The first was wrongful death, the value of Preston Thorne's estate $8.5 million, which had passed to Eleanor through what the filing characterized as a deliberate and premeditated act. The second was fraud and conversion arising from Eleanor's conduct toward Silas Pruitt, quantified at $3.2 million. The third was attempted fraud and intentional infliction of harm against Arthur Sterling, for which the filing sought $7 million, including punitive damages available under Georgia law for intentional torts. Attached to the complaint was a motion for prejudgment attachment under Georgia Code Section 1831. The logic of the motion was straightforward. To obtain a prejudgment attachment in Georgia, a plaintiff must demonstrate a valid claim, a reasonable basis to believe the defendant will dissipate or conceal assets before judgment can be enforced, and must post a bond to protect the defendant's interests if the attachment proves unwarranted. Julian had prepared the bond in advance. The basis for dissipation risk was, given that Eleanor had just been arrested for attempted murder, not difficult to establish. A Chatham County judge reviewed the motion at noon and signed the order at 12:41. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, every financial account in Eleanor Vane's name-checking savings, 2 brokerage accounts, and a money market fund she had opened under a slightly different name variant in 2021 was frozen. She could not access $1 of it. Vanguard Creative Group's legal team sent cease and desist letters to 14 companies the same afternoon. Each letter was addressed to the brand partnership contact on file, identified Vanguard as the exclusive rights holder to the name, likeness, and personal brand of Khloe Vane under the October agreement, and notified the recipient that any ongoing commercial arrangement with Khloe Vane constituted infringement of Vanguard's intellectual property rights. 11 of the 14 companies responded within 48 hours. 10 of them invoked the performance threshold clauses that had activated when Khloe's accounts were suspended in October, clauses that allowed them to terminate their contracts without penalty when a creator's reach fell below agreed minimums. One terminated on the basis of the cease and desist alone. The deposit Khloe had received upon signing $320,000 was subject to a liquidated damages provision in the Vanguard contract that Khloe had not read carefully. Vanguard retained it in full. By the end of the second day, Khloe Vane had no active brand partnerships, no accessible accounts on the platforms where her audience had lived, and no incoming revenue of any kind. Damon Voss had been waiting for a phone call for longer than most people wait for anything. I had reached out to him through an intermediary 3 weeks earlier, providing a summary of what Eleanor had done to him, what she had taken, and what was about to happen. I had also provided the name and direct contact information for Willa Sorrento. What Damon chose to do with that information was his own decision, made by a man who had spent years partially paralyzed and entirely without recourse. Watching the woman who had poisoned him live comfortably on money she had taken from people who trusted her. He called Willa on the afternoon of November 16th. They met in person 2 days later. He brought documentation, medical records, financial statements, correspondence that Willa would spend the following week verifying before publishing a second article that named Eleanor Vane not as a wife accused of attempted murder, but as a woman with a documented pattern of conduct spanning nearly 3 decades. Khloe called Julian's office 4 times between 9 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon on November 16th. Julian did not take the calls. His assistant noted each one and filed the records, as Julian had instructed. At 3:30, Khloe drove to Savannah. The gate at Sterling Manor was closed. Percival met her at the intercom, his voice carrying through the speaker with the same unhurried courtesy it always did, as though this were simply another ordinary exchange. "I'm sorry, Miss Vane," he said. "Mr. Sterling has asked me to let you know that this property is not available to you. If you have legal correspondence, I can accept it on his behalf." There was a long silence on the other end of the intercom. Khloe did not argue. She did not shout. She stood at the gate of a house she had called the family estate on camera to 340,000 people, and she had nothing to say to it. "Percival called me that evening." "She didn't say anything, sir. She just stood there." I set the phone down and looked at the wall for a moment. Khloe Vane was 28 years old and had just lost everything she thought she owned. But what she had not yet lost, what no one had yet taken from her, was the chance to understand why. There was still one person she had not spoken to. One person who would tell her the truth about Eleanor, about Preston, about what 28 years of being raised as Eleanor's instrument had actually cost her. That conversation was coming. And unlike everything else in this account, I had not planned it. I had simply left the door open, and I was waiting to see if she was willing to walk through it. Julian told me about it that evening, in the same precise, unadorned manner he used to report everything, facts, in order observations, where relevant. His own internal state mentioned only when I asked directly. I have reconstructed what follows from his account and from what I know of the 2 people in that room. Khloe arrived at the Bull Street office at 4:20 on a Thursday afternoon. She had not made an appointment. Julian's assistant had called back to ask if he wished to see her. Julian had said yes. She came in the way she always entered rooms, with the momentum of someone accustomed to being accommodated. She sat down across the desk without being invited to do so, set her bag on the chair beside her, and looked at Julian with the expression of a woman who has spent a difficult week reassembling her certainty and is not interested in having it questioned again. She wanted 2 things. She wanted Julian to identify a procedural defect in the Vanguard contract that would allow her to void it retroactively, and she wanted him to represent her in a civil action against Arthur Sterling for what she described with some precision of language as a coordinated campaign to destroy her livelihood and damage her reputation. Julian listened to her without interrupting. When she finished, he opened the desk drawer and took out a thin folder. He set it on the desk between them and did not open it. "Before we discuss your situation," he said, "there's something you need to know." Khloe looked at the folder. "What is that?" Julian opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Not a formal portrait, but the kind taken between other things with the unguarded quality of a moment that was not intended to be documented. A man in his mid-40s standing in front of a building with the name Thorne Properties visible on the glass behind him. He was looking slightly to the left of the camera and smiling at something outside the frame, the smile of a man in the middle of an ordinary good day. "Who is that?" Khloe asked. "His name was Preston Thorne," Julian said. "He was my father." He told her the rest, the way he told me things without inflection, without the kind of pauses people use when they want their words to carry dramatic weight. Preston had died in October of 2006, when Julian was 9 years old. The cause of death listed on the official record was an accidental fall. Arthur Sterling had been Preston's closest friend. Arthur had attended the funeral, said nothing to anyone about what he suspected, and had been quietly paying Julian's tuition since Julian was 11 years old. When Julian turned 18, Arthur had taken him to a restaurant on this same street. He gestured briefly toward the window and told him everything. "I've been working with Arthur for 16 years, Julian said. The Vanguard contract was not a coincidence. The Gala introduction was not a coincidence. None of it was. Khloe stared at the photograph. "You said you were interested in representing me," she said. Her voice had lost some of its earlier momentum, and I said I had an interest in working with content creators who had outgrown their representation. Julian's tone was not unkind, it was simply accurate. That was true. What I represented was Vanguard Creative Group. I have never represented you. There was a silence. Khloe's jaw tightened. Then she said quietly and with real anger, the first genuine emotion Julian told me he had heard from her. "You let me think you cared about me." Julian looked at her steadily. "I never said that," he replied. "I want to be clear about something because I think you deserve clarity, even if it's not what you came here for. I don't hate you, Khloe. What your mother did is not something you are responsible for. But I also never cared about you in the way you believed I did. Your mother killed my father. That is the fact that has organized the last 16 years of my professional life. This was not personal as far as you were concerned. It simply could not avoid affecting you." Julian told me she was quiet for a long time after that. Not the silence of someone thinking of what to say. The silence of someone in the process of revising something, a picture of herself and the world she occupied, that had until about 30 seconds ago seemed stable. Then she cried. He said it was not theatrical. There was no escalation, no collapse. She simply looked at the photograph of Preston Thorne, and something shifted in her face and her eyes filled, and she did not try to stop it. She did not say anything while it was happening. Julian remained seated. He did not offer her anything. He did not speak. He waited the way Arthur had taught him to wait, with patience that does not perform itself, that simply holds the space open and lets the other person do what they need to do. After a while, he stood up. "The Vanguard contract is legally sound. I reviewed it myself." He straightened the folder on the desk. "The evidence against your mother is not something any attorney in Georgia will be able to overcome. My advice to you, offered genuinely and without any further professional interest in your situation, is to retain independent counsel as soon as possible. Not to fight what's already been decided, to help you understand what your own exposure is and what options remain available to you." He moved toward the door. Khloe looked up. "Did he know?" she asked. "Arthur, did he know what she was doing to me the whole time?" Julian paused. "He knew what you were," Julian said. "He also knew that wasn't entirely your own doing. He left her with the photograph. He called me at 9 that evening. I asked him how he felt. He was quiet for long enough that I began to construct something to say to fill it. Then he said empty, not the way I thought it would feel. I did not tell him that I understood. I told him I did, which was different, and which he deserved to hear even if it couldn't change the feeling. Justice does not fill the spaces left by the dead. I have known that for 18 years, It only closes the account, stops the bleeding, puts a period at the end of a sentence that has been running without one for far too long. What remains afterward is quieter than you expected, and not quite the same shape as relief. There was still one thing left. One person who had been waiting longer than any of us in a small house on the Isle of Hope for the moment when his testimony would finally mean something. The Chatham County Courthouse in December looks the way justice ought to look: cold and unhurried, stripped of anything decorative, built entirely around the proposition that what happens inside its walls matters more than how it appears from the outside. The sky above Savannah that morning was the color of old pewter. The live oaks along Montgomery Street had shed most of their moss in the November wind, and their bare branches made a pattern against the clouds that reminded me, though I could not have explained why, of the diagrams in old legal documents, lines branching from a central point outward, each one leading somewhere specific. I had waited 18 years for this morning. I sat in the gallery, third row from the back, with Percival 2 seats to my left. Eleanor was at the defense table in a charcoal suit I did not recognize. She had purchased it after the arrest. I assumed, which required a level of attention to presentation that I had always found admirable in the particular way one finds an opponent's skill admirable. Her attorney was a man named Gerald Waverly from Atlanta, expensive and methodical, who had spent the past 3 weeks filing motions that Julian had spent the past 3 weeks answering. Rutherford Blaine entered at 9 sharp. The room stood. The prosecution's evidentiary presentation took the better part of the morning. The audio record from Sterling Manor, 47 separate recordings across a 4-year period, each authenticated through chain of custody documentation, and the technical testimony of the specialist Victoria Mercer had arranged, was entered into evidence without significant challenge. The recordings were not played in full. Selected excerpts were identified: Eleanor discussing asset transfer timelines on the night of Arthur's hospitalization. Eleanor asking, in a conversation captured by the hallway device, about what she described as natural progressions in cases of cardiac decline. The jury, 12 individuals who had spent 3 weeks being carefully selected, listened to each excerpt with the particular stillness of people who are constructing an understanding of something they had not previously believed possible. The chemical analysis came next. The inline sampling chamber recovered from Arthur's IV line on the night of November 15th had been transported directly to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Forensic Laboratory under Miles Quarry's documented custody. The laboratory report confirmed the presence of potassium chloride at a concentration of approximately 40 milliequivalents per liter in the captured sample, a level consistent with deliberate administration and inconsistent with any therapeutic use. The hospital's security footage, authenticated by the facility's technical director, showed Eleanor arriving at 2:11 a.m., entering the room at 2:14, and departing at 2:19. The timestamps on the sampling chamber's seal matched the window. Gerald Waverly objected to the chain of custody on the chemical evidence. He argued the sampling device had been installed without the patient's formal consent under standard hospital protocol. The prosecutor, a composed woman named Assistant District Attorney Renata Ferris, responded that Arthur Sterling was the patient, had provided written consent to his physician for all monitoring procedures, and had done so in a notarized document dated 3 weeks prior to the night in question. She then said, with the brevity of someone who understands that restraint is more effective than volume, "Mr. Waverly, the camera does not lie." Blaine sustained the evidence. Waverly noted his objection for the record. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Julian rose from the co-counsel table where he had been seated throughout the morning. "Your Honor," he said, "the state would like to call its final witness." Waverly was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, the defense was not notified of an additional—" The witness was listed in the supplemental disclosure filed November 28th. Julian said without raising his voice. He held up a document. "Page 4, Item 7. Blaine examined the filing. The witness was properly disclosed. Objection overruled. Proceed. The rear doors of the courtroom opened. Silas Pruitt was 60 years old and moved through the world in a wheelchair, the consequence of 18 years of living with neurological damage that no amount of treatment had fully reversed. He was thin in the way people become thin when their body has spent years fighting something it was not meant to absorb. His hair was white. His hands, resting in his lap as the court officer wheeled him forward, were the hands of a man who had learned over a very long time to be still. He was alive. He was present. He was against every expectation Eleanor Vane had carried for 16 years, sitting in the Chatham County Courthouse on a December morning about to speak. I watched Eleanor's face, the control she had maintained through 3 hours of audio recordings, through the chemical analysis, through Waverley's objections and Blaine's measured rulings. It left her in the space of approximately 2 seconds. She stared at Silas with the expression of someone who has opened a door they were certain led to an empty room and found it occupied. Her hand beneath the defense table pressed flat against the wood. Silas was sworn in. His voice was quiet but steady. He did not look at the jury. He looked at Ada Ferris, who walked him through his account methodically and without drama. He described 6 months of marriage to Eleanor Vane in late 2001 and into 2002, a union that ended not with divorce papers, but with a diagnosis he could not explain, and a wife who had simply stopped coming home. He described the progressive weakness, the numbness that moved from his feet upward the mornings when he could not hold a cup without assistance. He described the physician in Charleston who had years later identified the pattern as chronic arsenic exposure. He described Arthur Sterling appearing at his door in the spring of 2008, a man he had never met, carrying a photograph of a woman Silas had spent 2 years trying to forget. Julian then addressed the court regarding the physical evidence. In May of 2008, he explained Dr. Edmund Hale had collected hair and nail samples from Silas Pruitt under controlled conditions. Those samples had been placed in a sealed, notarized evidence container and deposited with First National Vault, a licensed legal document and evidence storage facility in Atlanta, Georgia. The container's seal had remained unbroken from the date of deposit until its retrieval under court order in October of 2024, a period of 16 years. The vault's custodian had provided sworn affidavit confirming the chain of custody. The GBI laboratory's analysis of the samples confirmed arsenic concentrations in the hair shaft, consistent with chronic low-dose poisoning over a period of 4 to 6 months. The documentation was entered into evidence. Waverley did not object. There was nothing to object to. Silas turned in his chair. For the first time since entering the room, he looked directly at Eleanor. "You thought you buried me, Ellie," he said. His voice did not waver. "I've been waiting a long time for today." The courtroom was silent. Not the anticipatory silence before something happens, the weighted silence of something that has already happened and is still being absorbed. Eleanor looked down at her hands. I had seen those hands hold a teacup sign, a document rest against a hospital IV line in the early hours of a November morning. They were in the end. The same hands that had measured arsenic into a morning cup of coffee for 6 months, adjusted the dose carefully enough to produce debility without immediate death, and then moved on to the next account. When that one was settled, she looked at them for a long time. I knew watching her that Eleanor Vane had not surrendered. A woman who had operated for 30 years on the conviction that she was more capable than the systems designed to contain her does not surrender in a courtroom because a dead man turns out to be alive. She recalculates. She looks for the remaining variables. She finds the one move that might still change the outcome. She still had one card left. The most reckless one she had ever considered playing. In 20 years of working with antique documents, I have handled more forgeries than most people encounter in a lifetime. A forged document, like a forged object, is not defined by how convincing it is. It is defined by who is looking at it, under what circumstances, and how badly they need it to be real. The most perfect fake in the world is worthless against a calm expert with adequate time. But a questionable piece presented to someone desperate enough under enough time pressure becomes something else entirely. Eleanor Vane was not tricked by a fake vase. She was undone by the situation I had spent 18 years engineering around her. She had posted bail on November 18th, $2.5 million cash bond drawn from a brokerage account she had opened 6 years earlier under a slightly different name variant, which the prejudgment attachment order had not immediately captured because the variant name had delayed the account identification process by approximately 36 hours. By the time Julian's team located and flagged the account, Eleanor had transferred the funds. The bail was posted. She was released pending trial. What remained once the attachment order was fully enforced and the bail funds were gone was $23,000 in a fireproof box in the Sterling Manor bedroom. Cash she had accumulated over 4 years in small amounts, withdrawn from grocery and household accounts that had not attracted scrutiny. It was the behavior of a woman who had always maintained a private exit strategy. It was not enough money to use one. A person cannot disappear effectively on $23,000. Not with a trial in Chatham County resuming in 48 hours. Not with a passport that had been flagged at every international port of departure by Miles Quarry's request the morning after her arrest. She needed substantially more than $23,000, and she needed it within 2 days. The Celadon vase had been in the Sterling Manor drawing room for 11 years. I had purchased it at auction in 2013 for $42,000, a legitimate piece, mid-19th century, in excellent condition. Eleanor had noticed it the first time she walked through the house, which told me something about what she paid attention to. She had asked me once casually what I thought it might be worth now. I had told her I had no idea. I had moved the vase to a locked display case in the study 6 weeks before the arrest. When Eleanor cleared the study in the days following her discovery of the secret room, she took it. I had expected her to. I had left the case key on the desk, deliberately, in a location she would find when she was looking for documents. She could not get the vase appraised by anyone reliable in Savannah. I had spent 3 weeks ensuring that every reputable antique and ceramics specialist in the city was either unreachable to her or had been quietly informed, through Percival, that their professional relationship with Arthur Sterling's estate made a private consultation with his estranged wife inadvisable. The one specialist she found willing to see her on short notice, a man who presented himself as an independent appraiser out of Brunswick, confirmed the vase as genuine and estimated its current market value at $180,000. He was in fact a retired document authenticator I had known for 9 years. He delivered his assessment with complete professional composure and called Percival from a gas station 30 minutes later. Eleanor knew the appraisal was fast. She knew it was from a source she had no way to verify fully. She knew there was a reasonable probability that she was walking into something she could not see clearly. But $180,000 would cover a flight, a new identity document from a contact she had used once before in 2003, and enough runway to disappear before a jury returned a verdict. $23,000 would not. When a person is desperate enough, the risk calculus changes. That is not a flaw in human reasoning. It is simply the arithmetic of diminishing options. I had spent 5 years reducing Eleanor's options one by one, carefully and quietly, so that when this moment arrived, she would have exactly this many choices left. She drove to Atlanta on the morning of December 9th, during the 48-hour recess Judge Blaine had granted after the first day of testimony. The Slaughton Auction House employs 3 full-time ceramic specialists. The senior among them examined the vase for 11 minutes before setting it down and asking Eleanor with professional courtesy where she had obtained it. Eleanor said it had been in her family for decades. The specialist said that was interesting, because the piece was a reproduction, quite a good one, but a reproduction nonetheless, made no earlier than the 1970s and bearing tool marks inconsistent with hand finishing of the period the piece purported to represent. Eleanor said nothing. Miles Quarry stepped forward from the far side of the room where he had been standing since before Eleanor arrived. Willa Sorrento was near the entrance with a press credential clipped to her jacket. She had received a call from Percival the previous evening. Arthur Sterling appeared on the auction house manager's laptop screen, connected by video from his desk at Factor's Walk, to confirm that the Celadon vase currently displayed in the Sterling Manor study, the genuine one purchased in 2013, was present intact and had not left the premises. They put the handcuffs on Eleanor for the second time in 3 weeks. She did not look at the vase. She understood in the moment before Miles Quarry reached her that the object had never been the point. The trap had not been the fake vase. The trap had been the 48 hours, and the $23,000, and the closed accounts, and the flagged passport, the accumulated pressure of 18 years of preparation, tightened to the point where even a careful, experienced woman made the only move available to her, which happened to be the move Arthur Sterling had been waiting for. Miles called me after they took her out. "That's 2 additional charges," he said. "Wire fraud and bail violation, on top of everything else." I thanked him and ended the call. I sat at my desk at Factor's Walk and looked at the genuine Celadon vase on the shelf across the room for a long time. $42,000 in 2013. Still worth approximately what I had paid for it. Khloe was still out there. And unlike her mother, she had not yet stood in front of a judge to answer for her own decisions. That was coming. I want to be clear about something before I describe that afternoon, because I think it matters for understanding what followed. I did not hate Khloe Vane. That will surprise some people. It surprised Julian when I told him, and he has known me for 16 years. But hatred is expensive. It consumes attention and energy that I have never found to be in surplus. And I had made a decision very early in this process to spend those resources on precision rather than emotion. What I felt about Khloe was something more complicated than hatred and considerably less satisfying, a kind of sorrowful recognition that she had been handed the worst possible education by the worst possible teacher and had never been offered any reason to learn differently. The second courtroom at the Chatham County Courthouse is smaller than the first. Same marble floors, same high windows, same quality of winter light that flattens everything into a kind of administrative gray. Khloe sat at the defense table in a dark blazer she had clearly purchased recently, her posture arranged into the best approximation of composure she could manage. It was not entirely convincing. But she was trying, which was more than I had expected. The charges were read by Ada Ferris, who had been assigned both cases. The first count was conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, grounded in the audio recordings from Sterling Manor. Specifically, the conversation captured on the night of Arthur's hospitalization, in which Khloe had inquired about the timeline for transferring Sterling Manor's title and the procedures for establishing legal authority over a partially incapacitated spouse's assets. Under Georgia law, a conspiracy charge requires an agreement and an overt act. In furtherance, the recordings provided both. The second count was commercial fraud, arising from a surrogacy arrangement Khloe had entered into with a private agency in Alpharetta, Georgia. The arrangement had not been difficult to locate. During the standard content audit Vanguard conducted, after the October signing a clause in the agreement permitted review of all existing content and correspondence relevant to the assigned brand rights, Victoria Mercer's team had found a draft post series titled Building Toward Something Real, scheduled 8 months earlier and never published. Alongside it was a calendar of appointments, a contract with an agency in Alpharetta, and a series of internal messages discussing how to manage the narrative across platforms before any public announcement was required. Khloe had not deleted any of it. She had simply never imagined anyone with legal authority would ever read it. Her attorney, a careful man from Atlanta named Reeves, built the defense around a single proposition. Khloe Vane was a 28-year-old woman who had grown up under the influence of a mother who modeled manipulation as a life strategy and concealed her crimes behind a performance of maternal devotion. Whatever Khloe had done, she had done in an environment that normalized it. She was not a perpetrator. She was a product. It was not an unreasonable argument. It was in fact the argument I would have made in his position. Damon Voss took the stand mid-afternoon. He was not a dramatic witness. He did not perform grief or anger, did not try to shape the jury's sympathy. He answered the questions he was asked with the economy of a man who has lived with difficult things long enough to speak about them without elaboration. He confirmed that Eleanor had, during their relationship, used Khloe as both shield and instrument, presenting a version of maternal devotion to the outside world that bore no relationship to the operational calculus happening underneath it. He said it without bitterness. The jury listened. Then Julian stood and nodded to the court's audiovisual technician. The footage had been obtained by Vanguard Creative Group during the standard content audit conducted after Khloe signed the October contract. A clause in the agreement permitted Vanguard to review existing content and correspondence relevant to the brand rights being transferred. Within that material was a 43-minute video recording of a meeting Khloe had conducted via video conference with representatives of the Alpharetta Surrogacy Agency, approximately 7 months earlier. The recording showed Khloe alone, no Eleanor, no advisor, no one else in the frame. She discussed the arrangement with the agency in specific detail, the timeline, the disclosure management strategy, which brand partners to inform and which to keep uninformed, how to document the pregnancy narrative across platforms to maximize its commercial impact before any announcement was required. She asked precise questions. She took notes. She thanked them for their discretion. The defense had no procedural basis to exclude it. The hallway outside the courtroom was empty when I walked out 20 minutes before the session ended. I needed air more than I needed to hear the closing arguments. I sat on a bench near the window at the end of the corridor and looked at the bare oak branches outside until I heard the doors open behind me. Khloe walked out with Reeves. He continued toward the elevator. She stopped. She stood in front of me for a moment without speaking. The composure she had maintained inside the courtroom was still in place, but it had the quality of something being held together by effort rather than confidence. "Did you ever actually care about me?" she asked. "Even a little." I looked at her for a moment. "I cared enough," I said, "to stop what your mother was planning to do to the next man after me." She was quiet. I did not look away, and neither did she. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one, the first honest silence, I thought, that had passed between any member of that household and any member of mine in 5 years. Then she nodded very slightly and walked toward the elevator. I watched her go, and I noticed in the way you notice things when you are no longer looking for anything specific, that for the first time in 5 years, I did not see an adversary when I looked at her. I saw a young woman who had been given from birth a map that led nowhere good, and had followed it, because no one had ever offered her a different one. Judge Blaine had indicated he would return his verdict the following week. I had one thing left to do before then. One promise made in a room full of Preston's papers that I had been carrying for 18 years. The blue navy suit I had worn to Preston's funeral was still in my closet. I had not touched it since October of 2006. I took it out that evening and pressed it carefully, the way my mother had taught me, and hung it on the door so it would be ready. The suit still fit. I stood in the bedroom of Sterling Manor at 6:15 in the January dark, and it fit exactly as it had in October of 2006, adequately without ceremony, built for function rather than impression. Percival was in the hallway when I came out. He looked at the suit without speaking for a moment. "The navy one," he said. "Yes." "May I ask why?" I picked up the briefcase, the same cracked leather briefcase now holding only one document. A certified copy of a trust instrument dated March 14, 2017. "Because today is the day I finish paying what I owe him," I said. The courthouse gallery was full before the doors opened. Willa Sorrento's 4-part investigative series had been picked up by national outlets, and Eleanor Vane had become something beyond a local case. She had become a symbol of a particular predation that people recognized, feared, and wanted to see answered. I sat in the third row. Percival 2 seats left. Julian at the co-counsel table. Silas Pruitt in the front row of the gallery in his wheelchair watching the door through which Eleanor would enter. She came in wearing the charcoal suit, composed as she had been every day. I had expected nothing different. Ada Ferris addressed the court for 20 minutes. The death of Preston Thorne, now reclassified as homicide following reinvestigation. The chronic arsenic poisoning of Silas Pruitt. The attempted murder at Savannah Memorial on November 15th. The pattern of financial fraud across 3 decades. Then Julian rose with a single document. Your Honor, I submit a certified copy of a trust instrument executed March 14, 2017, establishing the Preston Thorne Memorial Fund as an irrevocable trust under Georgia law, with Arthur Sterling named as founding grantor. He gave it to the clerk. The assets transferred at establishment totaled $47 million. Under the terms of an irrevocable trust, those assets ceased to be the legal property of the grantor upon transfer, unreachable by any subsequent marital claim, unreachable by any person asserting inheritance rights through the grantor. A pause. Eleanor Vane married Arthur Sterling in 2020. At that time, Arthur Sterling held no personal assets of meaningful value. The $47 million she believed she was pursuing had not belonged to him for 3 years before she met him. It has never at any moment been within her reach. The gallery went very still. Not the silence before something happens, the silence of a room revising what it thought it understood. Eleanor did not move. Her attorney placed a hand briefly on her arm, then removed it. Judge Blaine asked whether the defendant wished to address the court before sentencing. Eleanor stood. She looked at the bench. Then she turned and looked directly at me, the first time in the entire proceeding she had done so. You wasted 18 years of your life for this, she said. Even. No performance. The genuine observation of a woman who did not understand. Preston wasted his entire life trusting you, I said. 18 years was the least I could offer. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she turned back to the bench and sat down. Judge Rutherford Blaine's remarks took 4 minutes. He noted the premeditation evidenced across decades. He noted the number of victims, the deliberate targeting of vulnerability, the absence of any remorse. He sentenced Eleanor Vane to 35 years in the custody of the Georgia Department of Corrections, with no eligibility for early release. They came for her at 11:47. She walked with the same composure she had maintained throughout, not resignation, but the bearing of a woman who had decided at some point that she would not allow this to visibly cost her anything. She passed the gallery row by row. She stopped in front of mine. We looked at each other, a few seconds long enough. Then she walked through the door, and it closed behind her. Percival put his hand on my shoulder. Julian sat beside me, the face of a man who had finished something enormous and did not yet know what to do with his hands. Silas was crying quietly, the tears of someone who had been waiting a very long time for their occasion. Willa Sorrento was already typing. I held the empty briefcase in my lap and thought about Preston. About a pen borrowed in a survey course in 1965. About a phone call at 11:12 on a rainy October night. About a folded piece of paper in a sport coat pocket and 4 words pressed hard into it by a man who had understood something too late. He would have found all of this excessive, probably. He had never required large gestures, but he had deserved one. That evening, I drove back to Sterling Manor in the January dark. Something was waiting for me on the desk in the study. Something I had not put there. Something that had arrived while I was in that courtroom, paying the last of what I owed. What was on the desk was a padded envelope, no return address, postmarked from Athens, Georgia, 3 days earlier. Inside was a university alumni newsletter from 1966, printed on newsprint, gone the color of old honey, folded once along a crease that had been opened and refolded many times. Someone had circled a photograph near the bottom of the 3rd page with a red pen. Two students at a table in what appeared to be a dormitory study room, one of them leaning toward the other to look at something on the page between them. The caption read, "A Sterling and P. Thorne College of Arts and Sciences, 1966. On the back of the newsletter in handwriting I did not recognize and have never been able to identify for when it's over. I set it against the lamp on the desk and left it there. I did not need to know who had sent it. It was enough that someone had known to. Sterling Manor on the evening after the sentencing felt different from every other evening in the past 5 years. I noticed it the moment I came through the front door, something in the quality of the air, the way the house held the quiet around itself. Lighter, as though the building itself had been holding its breath for a long time and had finally been given permission to release it. Percival had been there all day. Every surface that had held Eleanor's things was clear, the mantelpiece returned to its original arrangement. The side tables restored to positions I had not seen in 5 years, the sitting room breathing again as a room rather than a performance space. The chair by the window was back where it had stood before 2020, at the angle I had always preferred facing the garden rather than the door. He had not said anything about any of it, and I did not ask. He had simply known what needed to be done, and he had done it before I arrived, so that I would not have to watch it happen. That was, I thought, the most accurate description of Percival Oakes that I could offer anyone. Julian arrived at 7. He had a key I had given him 2 years ago, and had not asked him to return. He came into the sitting room and sat down in the chair across from mine, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have finished something very large together and are not yet sure how to occupy the space it has left behind. I looked at him across the room, at the way he sat with his hands loose in his lap, his jacket still on, not quite relaxed, but no longer braced for anything. And I thought that this was perhaps the first time in 16 years I had seen him in a room without an agenda attached to being in it. He looked older than he had a year ago. Not old, he was 34. But something in his face had settled in a way that faces settle when weight is finally set down after being carried a long time. "Are you all right?" he asked eventually. I thought about it honestly before answering, because he deserved an honest answer. "I feel finished," I said. "That's different from feeling all right." He nodded slowly without rushing to fill it with reassurance. He understood the distinction without requiring it to be explained, which was, I thought, one of the things that had always made him Preston's son in ways that went beyond anything biological. We sat together for another hour without needing to say very much. It was enough. Victoria called at 9:15. Her voice was the same as it always was, direct, slightly dry, arriving at the point without detour. "How did it go?" 35 years, I said. "No early release." A pause. "Good. Are you well?" "I'm fine, Dad." The word landed somewhere in my chest that I had not expected, simple, unguarded, without the careful professional distance she had maintained across 8 years of necessary separation. "I've been watching the coverage. Willa's piece was extraordinary." "It was," I agreed. "Come home when you can, and bring your real name back with you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, small and genuine, the laugh I remembered from before, 2016, the one that had always arrived slightly ahead of whatever she thought was funny. "Friday," she said. "I'll be there Friday." I told her I would make sure Percival prepared the room she had always used. She said that was unnecessary. I said I would ask him anyway. The envelope arrived after Julian left. Percival brought it in on a small tray. A standard legal envelope, the return address, a law firm in Atlanta I did not recognize. Khloe's handwriting on the front, unassisted, addressed by hand rather than typed. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper. No letterhead. No date. 11 words in Khloe's handwriting pressed hard enough into the paper that the letters had a particular weight to them. The weight of something written quickly and without revision. "You won. I lost everything. But at least I'm not her." I read it twice. I held it for a moment, this small, graceless, entirely honest piece of paper, from a young woman who had grown up in a house where honesty was never modeled as anything other than a liability. It was not an apology. It was not addressed to me as someone she had wronged. It was the statement of someone who had looked directly at Eleanor Vane and for the first time recognized clearly what she was looking at and needed to say to someone that she was not the same thing. That whatever she was not that. It was the most truthful thing Khloe Vane had ever written, and it had cost her something to write it which made it worth keeping. I folded it once along the original crease and put it in my breast pocket. Julian was already gone. I did not think I would have told him anyway. The note belonged to Khloe's process, private, unwitnessed, just beginning. It was not mine to share. Later I went into the library. I sat down at the desk and opened the center drawer. The photograph was face down, where it had been for 18 years, taken out once a year on October 14th, and then replaced, each time with the same weight of unfinished obligation pressing against the back of it. Preston Thorne, in Athens, Georgia, spring of 1985. Looking slightly to the left of the camera, smiling at something outside the frame, I set it face up on the desk and sat across from it. For the first time since October of 2006, I did not feel the pressure of what was unresolved between us. The grief was still there. I have come to believe it does not go away, and I am no longer certain it should. Grief for someone who deserved more than they received is a form of witness. But the thing pressing against the grief all these years, the unfinished account, the open sentence that was gone. What remained was quieter, and I found more bearable than I had expected it to be. I sat with him for a long time. Then I set the photograph down and looked out the window at the live oaks along Forsyth Park. Their branches moving slowly in the January wind, the Spanish moss silver in the dark. Tomorrow, I had somewhere to go. A final promise made in silence to no one but myself on a rainy October night in 2006, while standing in Preston's study with a folded piece of paper in my pocket. I had not spoken it aloud to any living person. Not Julian, not Percival, not Victoria. Tomorrow I would keep it. There is one thing I have not told anyone. Not Julian, not Victoria, not Percival, who has been beside me for 19 years and knows most of what I know. The morning after Eleanor's sentencing, I asked Percival to drive me to Isle of Hope, and he did without asking why, because he understood that some obligations belong only to the person who made them. Silas was on the porch when we arrived. He had a cup of coffee in his hands and was watching the water the way people watch water when they have learned to be still, not waiting for anything. Simply present with it. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of January day that Savannah occasionally produces as evidence that it is capable of severity as well as softness. I sat down in the chair beside him. Percival remained at the car. For a while neither of us spoke. The water moved. A bird crossed the far end of the inlet and disappeared into the marsh grass. The coffee was good. He had made enough for two without being asked. "How do you feel?" Silas said eventually. "Finished," I said. "You?" He thought about it. "Like I can stay in one place now without watching the door." That seemed right. I understood it exactly. I reached into my jacket and set the envelope on the armrest of his chair. He looked at it without picking it up. Inside was a deed of transfer, the Isle of Hope house, the one he had been living in for 16 years, under an arrangement I had maintained quietly, now titled in his name outright. Paid in full, with no encumbrances. Also inside was a letter from the administrator of the Preston Thorne Memorial Fund, confirming a distribution sufficient to cover Silas Pruitt's living expenses, medical costs, and any reasonable needs for the remainder of his life. The fund's charter specified support for victims of financial and personal predation. Silas was the first person I had ever thought of when I wrote those words in a law office on Drayton Street in March of 2017. He picked up the envelope. He did not open it. "Preston always said you were the most stubborn man he'd ever known," he said. Something shifted in my chest, not grief exactly. Something adjacent to it, but warmer. He wasn't wrong, I said. We finished the coffee. The water kept moving. After a while, I stood up, shook his hand, and walked back to the car. I was at Factor's Walk by 2 o'clock. The office was quiet. The particular mid-afternoon quiet of a building that holds old things and has learned to be patient with them. I sat down at my desk, took out a clean legal pad, and uncapped the pen I had been carrying in my jacket pocket since the morning of the sentencing. Then I wrote the first sentence. My name is Arthur Sterling. I am 68 years old. There is something I want to be clear about, because it is the thing I have turned over most often in the month since. Eleanor Vane spent 5 years living in my house, sleeping in my house, eating at my table, and she never once knew with any certainty who I actually was. Not until she went down those stairs and found the photograph. For 5 years, I was simply Arthur Sterling, a name on a Savannah property list, a widower with assets and no heirs, a man whose medical file suggested he was running out of time, a target she had selected and assessed and found suitable. She did not know about Preston. She did not know about 2006. She did not know that the man she believed she was hunting had spent 15 years learning everything there was to know about her, while she had spent no time at all learning anything about him. That asymmetry was not accidental. It was the entire plan. She thought she was hunting. She had been inside the trap since the night she walked into the Telfair Rotunda Gallery in 2019 and made eye contact with a quiet man standing near the north wall who had been waiting for her for 13 years. She never knew that. And her certainty that she understood the situation, that she was, as she had always been, the most informed person in any room she entered, was the thing that made her blind. I am not writing this to celebrate that. I am writing it because silence has a cost that people rarely account for in advance. I kept mine for 18 years, not because I had nothing to say, but because I needed to be certain that when I spoke, it would be the last word. There are people who are living in silence right now under the weight of things they cannot prove and cannot escape and cannot explain to anyone who has not experienced them. I understand that weight. I carried it for a very long time. I do not know how many years I have left. At 68, you begin counting differently. But I know this: when I see Preston again, wherever that is, I will be able to look at him directly and tell him that I did not stand by and watch. Sometimes that is all a friendship asks of you. I set down my pen as the last light of evening colored the cobblestone streets of Savannah gold. There is one thing I know with certainty after all these years, not because I was smarter than Eleanor, not because I was better prepared, but because the truth always finds its way into the light. People say that God is never in a hurry, but he is never late either. I witnessed that with my own eyes. But if you are reading this and thinking that the road I walked is worth following, don't be like me. I lost 18 years. 18 years not permitting myself to rest, to forget to simply continue living. This is a grandpa stories without a gentle ending. Every grandpa stories carries its own price, and the price of this one was 18 years that can never be recovered. I tell it as a grandpa stories so that you do not have to pay as dearly as I did. If you are carrying something too heavy, put it down sooner than I did. Your life, your time, the people you love cannot wait 18 years. Every family story holds secrets outsiders never see. Sometimes love, sometimes a wound, sometimes both. No family story is perfect, but honest stories are sometimes worth more than happy endings. The story of Preston, Eleanor, Julian, Victoria. This is the family story I carry until the end of my life. Not because I am proud, but because it reminds me that a person can endure a great deal and still choose not to become their own enemy. If this touched something in you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and stay for what comes next. Thank you for staying with me to the very last line. Some stories ahead contain fictional elements built purely for educational purposes. If that is not for you, step away and find content that is worth your time.